Welcome to a new program. On today's show, Mexico won or lost with the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement. Our guest, Manuel Pérez Rocha, Associate Fellow with the IPS, the Institute for Policy Studies. Manuel Pérez Rocha, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jorge, for having me.
Manuel, what do you think about where we are regarding the renegotiation of the NAFTA free trade agreement between Mexico, United States, and Canada?
Well, first of all, it's a little difficult to know where we are because these negotiations have been shrouded in complete secrecy. The little we know, thanks to the USTR, the United States Trade Representative, that has publicized some of the gains for the United States
Quote,
of this agreement. Yeah, quote unquote. But from the Mexican government, we have no information, only that the negotiations have been concluded in principle, which doesn't mean much because actually the texts have not been finalized. What they have agreed so far is kind of an agreement in principle or in certain principles, and that is what we have so far. But the terms are, I think, not very favorable for the Mexican people.
Why?
For example, in terms of one of the biggest problems in Mexico is the need to reactivate the Mexican countryside. And this is one of the big promises of the President-elect Andrés López Obrador.
Who is starting in office?
He's starting in office on December 1st. We have one of the longest periods in the world between elections and starting office.
July the election?
Yeah. 6 months. The importance of reactivating the depressed Mexican countryside that has caused so much migration, I think it's going to be severely handcuffed or curtailed by what the United States Trade Representative announces as greater access to big United States companies to the Mexican countryside or the Mexican consumers, in particular to corporations that are exporting products with high content of, for example, GMOs or other biotechnology advances, quote unquote.
Genetically modified organisms.
This is very worrying for Mexico in terms of the need of Mexican peasants, Mexican farmers to recover from the very strong impact that NAFTA has already had in the Mexican countryside. There are other things announced by the USTR, the United States Trade Representative, as gains for the United States. For example, in terms of intellectual property rights, for the corporations, of course.
The U.S. corporations.
Yeah, which help them to extend the time in which they can have a patent on certain product, in particular pharmaceuticals, for example. This would have a big impact, well, on the Mexicans in general, but for example, on the Mexican health system in being able to produce generic medicines for the cheaper medicines for the Mexican people, and so on. Most of what the USTR announces are gains for the U.S. corporations, which means
losses for Mexico.
Losses for the Mexican people.
Why the renegotiation? What happened?
Well, the renegotiation is product of, I would say, tantrum of President Trump, that he really wanted to show to a part of his electorate, which are working people in the Rust Belt area, as it's called.
Exactly.
That he would deliver on his promises of campaign, because this is the working class in the United States that has been also severely affected by the NAFTA, by the North American Free Trade Agreement, since its implementation. It's calculated that there's been almost around 1 million jobs lost in the United States because of companies, mostly auto and other technological companies, moving to Mexico to produce there because it's much cheaper, obviously. So this was one theme of the campaign of President Trump, delivering to the workers that have lost to Mexico, and he is trying to comply there. This rush to renegotiate the free trade agreement has definitely a very strong electoral component. President Trump wants to close the deal before the elections of November.
The midterm election
The
November
midterm
6th.
elections of November 6.
What happened that Canada is not there yet?
I think shameful for the Mexican government to have continued the renegotiations without the full participation of Canada. We cannot talk about a deal between Mexico and the US when legally NAFTA is a trilateral agreement. So we have to wait for Canada. And so far, in my opinion, what the Mexican government has done is yield to the divide and conquer strategy of President Trump.
So the bottom line, the end is going to be Mexico and Canada and the US at the end of the day, again, with a new agreement, or this is going to be the end of NAFTA as we knew it, and it's going to be just two separate bilateral agreements between Mexico and the US and Canada and the US?
Quite frankly, I don't know. I think it depends on how much Canada is willing to also surrender to President Trump's priorities.
What are the differences that are being discussed?
I think a big difference is dairy, the dairy industry of Canada. Canada is trying to defend and protect its farmers, in particular on dairy, and they have some certain rules that allow their dairy producers to buy local instead of having to open up their markets and so on. I'm not a particular expert on that, but that's what I understand is the big difference now that Trump wants to open up the whole dairy industry of Canada to US importers and exporters and so on. So I think that's a big difference. Another difference has to do with, and this is very, very tricky, with ISDS system, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, by which corporations can sue governments in, particularly here in Washington, the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, hosted by the World Bank. This is a very hot issue because this allows corporations to bypass national courts and take governments there and sue them for hundreds of millions of dollars when public policies affect not only their investments, but also their what is called indirect expropriation, what they expected to win. So they get reimbursed, let's say, or
ahead of time.
Ahead of time. So this is a system that operates globally. There are more than 600 cases at the ICSID nowadays. It is very hotly debated. But what's really tricky here is that it is the President Trump initiative, or his government's initiative, to get rid of that system. And paradoxically, Canada, that has been sued for billions of dollars and has lost billions of dollars, is the one who wants to keep it, while the United States, that hasn't lost one case, is the one who wants to get rid of it. It's paradoxical, it's a bit complicated, but the argument of the Trump presidency is that they want to prevent US corporations from moving abroad with the protection of this system.
One of the issues that has been discussed was that the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement between the delegations of the Mexico and US government were almost stalled, and then Andrés Manuel López Obrador won overwhelmingly the election, and the goodwill of his team of participating in that was helping to reach at least this agreement in principle. Is that the way it worked?
That's another paradox in this, what I call Kafkaesque situation of NAFTA. It's another paradox because it is, I think I've always understood, and I still understand, that Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the president-elect of Mexico, has been critical of NAFTA and of free trade in general. However, since he won the presidency by such an overwhelming result, he and his team, his economic team in particular, have been very careful in the way in their attitude towards trade and investment. I think this has helped indeed to advance in the negotiations of NAFTA. How much? I still don't know, because, as I said, the pact is secret. The negotiations are secret. We don't have the texts. But he has one person in particular that has been participating in the negotiations. One person of his team, of his economic team, has been also advising in the negotiations. So we expect that the next president, that the next government of Mexico will make public, as soon as it takes office, the texts, and will open up a consultation with social sectors, with trade unions, with farmers, with environmentalists, and so on in Mexico before closing the deal, if the deal wasn't closed before he takes office.
Tell me about what is being presented, at least here in the US, free trade or free trade agreements like NAFTA, and immigration issues, and they presented to the American public like two separate issues with no connection one with the other. Are they completely disconnected or not?
No, they're not. On the contrary, and I'm glad that you make this question. I think this is one of the most important questions to make. How free trade agreements impact on the livelihoods of people. And the verdict after 23 years of NAFTA, or after 12 or 13 years of CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the verdict is that the humanitarian crisis that we live today, and we've been living for so many years, from Central America to Mexico, and the huge flow of people that is so recriminated today by President Trump and the right in the US, is a product of wrong economic policies, or economic policies that have helped only the rich, only the corporations, but have had dramatic effects on the livelihoods of the most disaffected, in particular farmers, small farmers, and workers.
So we're talking about thousands and thousands of Central Americans coming, especially from what is called the Northern Triangle. So we're talking about El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and also from Mexico, coming every day to the border with the US. As you mentioned, a humanitarian crisis, because they don't want to come because they are looking for freedom and democracy. If not, they're absolutely running for their lives. And that has to do with their policies. So is it pervert that the media here, they don't talk about that humanitarian crisis that eventually could affect national security, as President Trump, whenever believes that he's important, he brings the issue of quote-unquote national security. And that issue is not being brought to the national discussion, but they have the guts that identify, for example, there are problems in Venezuela with migrants leaving the country, and we are repeatedly hearing that litany, and also the OAS, the Organization of American States, through his Secretary General Almagro, permanently bombard that thing. Is that perverse? Is that double standard?
Well, yeah, of course it's perverse. It's also perverse when they find any boat of Cuban people trying to reach Central America and magnify it like a demonstration of the failed Cuban regime and so on. When we have the most important migration in the hemisphere, at least, comes from the countries that have signed a free trade agreement with the United States, Mexico and the Central American countries. And we can demonstrate direct links between the policies contained in NAFTA and the impacts they've had in destroying millions of livelihoods, in particular in the countryside, as I said, but also the destruction of scores, tens of thousands of small and medium companies.
Because one of the issues that they use as a weapon is subsidies. For example, in the first 10 years of NAFTA, the US government gave $55 billion to the US large agricultural corporations to subsidize the price of their crops, export them to Mexico, leave millions of agriculture workers in Mexico jobless. And same thing in Central America. And then we are hearing from President Trump that he just asked for fair trade and not free trade, when they seems that have been practicing for years and years unfair trade through subsidies.
Right. I mean, the whole system is so rigged in favor of large corporations, while the United States, and this happens with Europe as well, that they subsidize their farmers so largely. While they subsidize their farmers, at the same time, Mexico, Central America, and most Latin American countries have undergone through structural adjustment policies imposed by the World Bank. One of them is the withdrawal of subsidies, the withdrawal of credit,
the
withdrawal of support mechanisms to the farmers, to the same farmers that are being affected by the imports.
So do what I say, but not what I do.
Exactly the contrary. Yeah.
Also,
so it's a completely
hypocrisy.
A hypocrite system, and I think we have to see the free trade agreements in this context, in the context of the imposition of austerity policies and so on by the IMF and the World Bank upon our countries. No?
Here, when that sort of agreement in principle, as you mentioned, between the Mexican government and the US government has been announced like a big victory, triumph, we haven't seen representatives of trade unions in Mexico with the Mexican delegation here in the embassy, and of course in the US neither. And we have seen the decrease of the participation of the workers in the US, 33% about 30 years ago, 7% today. So they are making sure, the big corporations in the US, that they're going to demolish as much as they can everything that has to do with the organization of the workers through trade unions?
Right. Yes. I think there's been nil participation from trade unions, farmers, from any interested sector, from the people in general. But this is also part of the continuation of policy of I would say, the capitalist global system to destroy the capacity of workers to organize. Now, let's be clear that the United States is also announcing, the USTR, that there's been some gains in terms of labor rights in Mexico with the new NAFTA, the NAFTA 2.0 as they call it. And they announced that, for example, that the auto sector in Mexico, in order to export back to the United States, they have to pay $16 an hour to the workers in Mexico. This is a gain, and it's very much a product of the work of unions in the United States that have been really working hard to make the U.S. government pressure the Mexican government to raise the wages. But these wages are being raised in a very, very small sector. Only, I understand, 0.7% or so of the working force in Mexico work or are related to the auto industry. So while they announced this as a big advance, which is an advance in itself, it doesn't have an impact in the rest of the economy or in the rest of the working class in Mexico. So we have to be careful of how they use also electorally the tiny advances they might make in labor rights for electoral purposes here in the United States.
We were mentioning that the overwhelming victory of Andrés Manuel López Obrador in the past presidential elections, we're talking about he got about over 60% of the votes against 25% of the votes of the second or the runner-up, so it was really a shellac, as they say in English, was playing a role in order to advance that agreement in principle of the NAFTA 2.0, as you mentioned. But how you think are going to be the relations between López Obrador and Trump once that López Obrador take over?
Well, I think they're going to be tense because the President Trump insists on his wall. Right after the presentation, they didn't sign anything. The presentation of the deal between Mexico and the U.S. Right after that, he went somewhere else to say that he was still going to build a wall. So he has that as an electoral campaign promise. He will never leave the issue with his base. So while he continues to do that, there will be no room for Andrés Manuel López Obrador not to confront and to deny anything to do with the wall. But this is just an example of policies of superiority, of this despise superiority and attitudes that President Trump has, and condescendence, the right word, towards Mexico, that Andrés Manuel López Obrador will have to put up with, and I trust that he will. And he will show that Mexico has interests, priorities, and he will put forward the necessary measures to advance in what he called the alternative project for the nation.
So what do you think about that is going to be the impact of AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in the future of Mexico? Is that a turning point in the history of Mexico?
I think it's a turning point politically, because he has won with a great legitimacy the political power to put aside a corrupt political class and to change a regime into a more honest one, more deliberate to the Mexican people. He has promised a number of social programs to help overcome the big poverty. Mexico has more than 50% of its population under poverty levels. And I think he has the capacity, because he showed it when he was the mayor of Mexico City, to deliver to the Mexican people. However, he will be very constrained, and I think he knows it, by the neoliberal system that he still has its main pillars
in place.
The elections don't change that, and he will need to really juggle between the factual powers that have the power in Mexico, the financial system,
the media,
and also the military and the Navy and the real powers, and the people that he has to respond to.
And finally, do you think that his taking over the presidency of Mexico could also have an impact in other countries in Latin America? In which way?
Well, I hope so. I think Latin Americans have been, in the last years, deceived by the turn back to the right, particularly in countries like Brazil, Argentina, even Chile. And I think Latin Americans need to see that projects from the left or center left, if you want to call it, are still possible. And Mexico is now the country to look for. After so many years, which was the other way around, Mexico is now the country that signifies hope for so many Latin Americans.
Manuel Pérez Rocha, thanks very much for joining us.
No, thank you for inviting me, Jorge.